The Mississippi River churned with unusual fury on that gray morning of December 18th, 1862, as if the mighty Waterway itself sensed the approaching storm of war. Major General Ulysses Simpson Grant stood on the deck of his command vessel, watching the muddy waters swirl past the bluffs of Vicksburg, Mississippi. The city perched like a defiant eagle's nest atop towering limestone cliffs, its Confederate batteries commanding every bend of the river for miles in either direction. "There she sits," Grant muttered to his aide-de-camp, lighting his ever-present cigar against the December chill, the key to the entire war. Vicksburg was no ordinary Confederate stronghold. President Abraham Lincoln himself had declared that the war could never be won until the Union controlled the Mississippi River from its source to the sea, and Vicksburg stood as the final barrier to that dream. The city's strategic position allowed Confederate forces to control river traffic, splitting the Union in two and providing a vital supply line between the Eastern and Western Confederacy. The weather had already begun to play its hand in this unfolding drama. The winter of 1862 had brought unprecedented rainfall to the Mississippi Valley, swelling tributaries and turning the countryside into a vast maze of swamps, bayous, and flooded fields. What should have been solid ground for military operations had become a waterlogged nightmare that would challenge every conventional military strategy. Grant's first attempt to take Vicksburg had ended in disaster just days earlier. General William Tecumseh Sherman's direct assault on the Chickasaw Bluffs north of the city had been repulsed with heavy casualties, the Union forces struggling through knee-deep mud under withering Confederate fire. The lesson was clear: Vicksburg would not fall to conventional frontal assault. As Grant studied the forbidding bluffs through his field glasses, he understood that this campaign would require something unprecedented in American military history. The city's natural defenses, enhanced by months of Confederate engineering, presented challenges that would demand innovation, patience, and a willingness to embrace unconventional warfare. The Confederates had turned Vicksburg into what they proudly called the Gibraltar of the Confederacy, bristling with artillery and defended by some of their finest troops. Under the command of Lieutenant General John Clifford Pemberton, the Mississippi River itself presented both opportunity and obstacle. While it offered Union forces the advantage of naval support and supply lines, the river's unpredictable nature and the Confederate control of its banks made any water-based approach treacherous. The ironclad gunboats of Admiral David Dixon Porter provided firepower, but they could not climb the 200-foot bluffs to silence the Confederate batteries that commanded the river. Grant's reputation had been built on bold, decisive action, but Vicksburg demanded something different. Intelligence reports indicated that Pemberton commanded nearly 30,000 Confederate troops within the city's defenses, supported by over 100 artillery pieces positioned to sweep every approach. The civilian population, fiercely loyal to the Confederate cause, had transformed their city into a fortress, digging caves and tunnels throughout the limestone bluffs to shelter from bombardment. As the year 1860 drew to a close, Grant faced perhaps the greatest challenge of his military career. The eyes of the nation were upon him, and failure here could mean the prolongation of a war that had already cost hundreds of thousands of lives. The weather, the waterways, and the nature of warfare itself would all conspire to make the Vicksburg campaign one of the most complex and innovative military operations in American history. The stage was set for an epic confrontation that would test every aspect of 19th century military science against the raw power of nature and human determination. The winter months of 1863 brought challenges that no military academy had prepared Grant to face. The Mississippi River, swollen by relentless rains, had transformed the entire region into a vast inland sea. Maps became useless as familiar landmarks disappeared beneath muddy waters, and roads that had existed for decades vanished into impassable swamps. "General, the men are calling it Grant's Canal," reported Colonel James Harrison Wilson, barely concealing his skepticism as he gestured toward the mass of earthworks taking shape across from Vicksburg. The January wind whipped across the construction site where thousands of Union soldiers labored in knee-deep mud, attempting to dig a canal that would redirect the Mississippi River itself. Grant's audacious plan was born of desperate necessity. If Union forces could not approach Vicksburg directly, perhaps they could make the city irrelevant by forcing the Mississippi to carve a new channel. The idea was theoretically sound, but practically nightmarish. The soldiers, many from urban areas who had never handled a shovel before the war, struggled against the Mississippi Delta's notorious soil sticky, clay-like substance that clung to everything and dried hard as concrete when exposed to air. Day after day, the men dug while Confederate artillery on the Vicksburg bluffs occasionally sent shells screaming overhead, more as harassment than serious bombardment. The psychological effect was devastating. Soldiers who had volunteered to fight for the Union found themselves engaged in backbreaking manual labor that seemed more suited to civilian contractors than warriors. The weather became an active enemy. February brought alternating periods of bitter cold and torrential rain. When temperatures dropped, the muddy water in the partially completed canal turned to ice, making work impossible. When it rained, the excavation filled faster than the men could bail it out. Disease spread rapidly through the camps as soldiers lived in constant dampness. Their uniforms never fully dry, their equipment rusting despite constant care, according to detailed accounts preserved in the National Archives. Grant's canal project consumed over 2 months of intensive labor, involving nearly 20,000 troops. Grant himself remained outwardly confident, but his private correspondence revealed growing doubts about the feasibility of the project. The Mississippi River, it seemed, had its own ideas about where it wanted to flow, and no amount of human effort could easily convince it otherwise. While the canal project dominated public attention, Grant secretly authorized several other experimental approaches to the Vicksburg problem. The Lake Providence expedition attempted to create a water route through Louisiana's backwaters, connecting with the Red River to approach Vicksburg from the south. Engineer crews worked to clear centuries of fallen trees and debris from narrow bayous, creating passages barely wide enough for a single gunboat. Another scheme involved the Yazoo Pass expedition, where Union engineers deliberately destroyed a levee to flood thousands of acres of Mississippi Delta farmland, creating a navigable waterway where none had existed before. The environmental destruction was staggering, but military necessity demanded extreme measures. Each of these projects faced the same relentless enemy, the Mississippi Delta's unique geography. The region's flat terrain meant that any water route quickly spread into countless smaller channels, creating a maze where military formations could easily become separated and lost. Confederate forces, intimately familiar with the local geography, used this to their advantage, establishing small but effective ambush positions along the few navigable channels. The psychological toll on Union troops grew heavier with each failed experiment. Letters home described the frustration of soldiers who had enlisted to fight for their country but found themselves engaged in engineering projects that seemed doomed from the start. Morale plummeted as news of Confederate victories elsewhere reached the muddy camps around Vicksburg. Grant faced mounting pressure from Washington to produce results. Politicians and newspaper editors, safe in their distant offices, demanded action and criticized the apparent lack of progress. What they could not understand was that the Vicksburg campaign had become a battle against geography itself, where traditional military tactics held little relevance, and success required innovation beyond anything previously attempted in American warfare. By March 1863, Grant faced a crisis that threatened to end his military career. The canal project had become a public embarrassment, with newspapers across the North ridiculing what they called Grant's folly. Politicians in Washington whispered about replacing him with a more conventional general who would attempt a direct assault on Vicksburg's defenses, regardless of the expected casualties. But Grant possessed something his critics lacked, an intimate understanding of how weather at Waterways could be transformed from obstacles into opportunities. Late one evening, as he studied maps by lamplight in his cramped headquarters aboard the river steamer Magnolia, inspiration struck with the force of revelation. Colonel Rawlins, Grant called to his chief of staff, "What if we'd been thinking about this problem entirely backwards?" The solution that emerged would become one of the most brilliant strategic innovations in military history. Instead of fighting against the Mississippi River's natural behavior, Grant decided to use it. Rather than approaching Vicksburg from the north, where Confederate defenses were strongest, he would march his army down the Louisiana side of the river, then cross below the city to attack from the unexpected direction the south and east. The plan required unprecedented cooperation between Army and Navy forces. Admiral Porter's gunboats would have to run past Vicksburg's artillery batteries under cover of darkness, a maneuver that most naval officers considered suicidal. The guns positioned on Vicksburg's bluffs commanded the river with overlapping fields of fire, and any vessel attempting to pass would face concentrated bombardment for nearly 2 miles. Grant's decision to abandon the canal project freed up his entire army for the new strategy. In early April, he began moving 45,000 troops down the Louisiana side of the Mississippi, using whatever roads existed and building new ones where necessary. The movement required careful coordination to avoid alerting Confederate scouts to the true nature of the operation. The weather, which had been Grant's enemy for months, finally began to cooperate. April brought drier conditions that made overland movement possible, though the soldiers still struggled through miles of muddy bayou country. Confederate cavalry under General Nathan Bedford Forrest harassed the Union columns whenever possible, but they could not stop the massive movement of men and equipment through Louisiana's back country. On the night of April 16th, Porter's fleet made its desperate run past Vicksburg's guns. Grant himself watched from the Louisiana shore as the drama unfolded in the darkness. Confederate sentries spotted the lead vessels when they were still miles upriver, and soon the entire waterfront erupted in flames. As artillery batteries opened fire, the bombardment was spectacular and terrifying. Confederate gunners had prepared for months for just such an attempt, pre-positioning their artillery to create interlocking fields of fire that would devastate any fleet trying to pass. Shell after shell screamed across the water, many finding their marks on the Union vessels. The transport Henry Clay took a direct hit and began to burn, its crew abandoning ship in small boats. But Porter's careful preparation paid dividends. His ships had been reinforced with cotton bales and logs to absorb artillery hits, and their crews had practiced the passage repeatedly during daylight hours to ensure they knew every bend and sandbar. Most importantly, the admiral had timed the passage to coincide with a moonless night, making accurate targeting nearly impossible for Confederate gunners. By dawn, most of Porter's fleet had successfully passed Vicksburg's defenses and was assembling at New Carthage, Louisiana, 30 miles downriver. The losses were significant, but not crippling. 1 transport destroyed, several vessels damaged, and 13 sailors killed or wounded. More importantly, Grant now had naval support below Vicksburg. For the first time since the campaign began, the psychological impact on both sides was enormous. Confederate defenders, who had grown confident in their impregnable position, suddenly realized that Union forces could operate on both sides of their fortress city. For Union troops, the successful passage proved that their commander possessed both the vision and the determination to find solutions to seemingly impossible problems. Grant's innovation extended beyond mere tactical maneuvering. He understood that the campaign's success would depend on speed and surprise. Once the river crossing began, traditional military doctrine called for establishing secure supply lines before advancing into enemy territory, but Grant planned to cut loose from his river-based supplies entirely, living off the land during the advance inland. The morning of April 30th, 1863, dawned clear and warm along the Mississippi River near Bruinsburg, Louisiana. Grant had chosen this crossing point with characteristic attention to terrain and timing. The location offered several advantages. Confederate defenses were minimal. The bluffs on the Mississippi side were lower than at Vicksburg, and good roads led inland toward the state capital at Jackson. Porter's gunboats had spent the previous week systematically reducing what few Confederate positions existed along the river bank. The ironclads Louisville and Mount City had engaged in fierce artillery duels with hastily constructed Confederate batteries, their heavy guns gradually silencing resistance and clearing the way for the massive amphibious operation that Grant planned. The river crossing itself represented a logistical triumph that would influence military operations for decades to come. Grant's quartermasters had assembled a fleet of transports, barges, and converted civilian vessels capable of moving an entire Army corps across the mile-wide Mississippi in a single day. The operation required precise timing, as Confederate reinforcements were rushing toward the area from multiple directions. General John Alexander McClernand's 13th Corps led the assault crossing, their boats pushing off from the Louisiana shore at first light. The soldiers, many of whom had never seen combat, clutched their rifles and peered nervously at the approaching Mississippi bluffs. Veterans of earlier campaigns tried to reassure the newcomers, but everyone understood that they were crossing more than just a river. They were entering Confederate territory. With no secure line of retreat, Confederate resistance at the landing site proved lighter than expected, but Lieutenant General John Clifford Pemberton was already responding to reports of the Union river crossing. From his headquarters in Vicksburg, Pemberton dispatched Brigadier General John Stevens Bowen with 4,000 troops to contain the Union beachhead. The stage was set for the first major land battle of the Vicksburg campaign, The Battle of Port Gibson, fought on May 1st, demonstrated how terrain continued to shape every aspect of the campaign. The Mississippi Delta's unique geography created a battlefield unlike any previously seen in the Civil War. Dense forests broken by deep ravines channeled military movements into predictable corridors, while numerous streams and bayous provided natural defensive positions. Bowen's Confederate forces, familiar with local geography, initially held the advantage despite being outnumbered. They positioned artillery on commanding ridges and used the thick underbrush to conceal their movements from Union scouts. When McClernand's lead regiments advanced inland from the river crossing, they walked into carefully prepared ambushes that sent them reeling back toward the Mississippi. Grant himself arrived at the battlefield by mid-morning, quickly assessing the tactical situation and deploying reinforcements where they would prove most effective. His ability to read terrain and anticipate enemy movements had been honed by months of studying the Vicksburg region's unique characteristics. He recognized that Bowen's defensive position, while strong, depended on interior lines that could be broken by coordinated pressure from multiple directions. The battle raged throughout the day as more Union troops crossed the Mississippi and joined the fighting. Artillery duels echoed across the Delta landscape, while infantry formations maneuvered through forests so thick that regiment commanders frequently lost contact with their own units. The weather remained cooperative, with clear skies allowing Union signal corps to maintain communication between separated formations using flag semaphore. By evening, superior Union numbers began to tell. Bowen's Confederates, despite fighting with desperate courage, could not hold their positions against mounting pressure from three different directions. As darkness fell, they began a fighting withdrawal toward Vicksburg, leaving the field to Grant's forces. The victory at Port Gibson cost the Union Army nearly 300 casualties, while Confederate losses exceeded 500 killed, wounded, and missing. More importantly, Grant had established his army on Mississippi soil with a secure bridgehead that could support further operations inland. That night, as Grant planned his next moves, he faced a decision that would define the remainder of the campaign. Military convention suggested consolidating his position along the Mississippi River, establishing secure supply lines, and building up overwhelming strength before advancing further into Confederate territory. But Grant understood that speed was essential. Every day of delay allowed Pemberton to strengthen Vicksburg's defenses and gave Confederate forces in other parts of Mississippi time to concentrate against the Union invasion. In his tent beside the battlefield, surrounded by maps and intelligence reports, Grant made the decision that would transform him from a competent general into a military legend. He would cut loose from his supply lines entirely, living off the land while conducting a rapid campaign to isolate Vicksburg from Confederate reinforcements. The strategy violated every principle taught at West Point, but Grant had learned to trust his instincts over conventional wisdom. The morning of May 7, 1863, found Grant's army marching inland through Mississippi's hill country, leaving behind the familiar sight of the Mississippi River for the first time since the campaign began. The decision to abandon secure supply lines sent shockwaves through Union command structure, with several corps commanders privately questioning their commanding general's sanity. "Gentlemen," Grant addressed his staff officers as they studied maps around a campfire near Rocky Springs, "we are about to prove that an army can indeed travel faster than the telegraph." His reference was pointed by cutting communications with his headquarters. Grant had also severed the ability of politicians in Washington to interfere with his tactical decisions. The strategy unfolding represented revolutionary thinking in 19th century warfare. Traditional military doctrine demanded secure supply lines, established bases of operation, and careful coordination with higher headquarters. Grant was abandoning all of these principles in favor of speed, surprise, and the calculated risk that his army could live off Mississippi's agricultural abundance. Intelligence reports indicated that Confederate General Joseph Eggleston Johnston was assembling a relief army near Jackson, Mississippi's capital city. While Pemberton's forces in Vicksburg remained uncertain about Union intentions, Grant recognized that his greatest opportunity lay in preventing these two Confederate armies from combining their forces, a classic application of the principle of defeating enemies in detail. The weather continued to favor Union operations. May typically brought heavy rainfall to Mississippi, but 1863 proved unusually dry, allowing rapid movement over roads that would normally become impassable. Confederate cavalry under Colonel Wirt Adams harassed the Union columns whenever possible. but they lacked sufficient strength to seriously impede the advance. Grant's logistics officers performed miracles of improvisation during the march inland. The Army carried minimal supplies, relying instead on systematic foraging operations that swept the countryside for food, fodder, and equipment. Mississippi's plantation economy, built on agricultural abundance, provided everything the Union Army needed if it could be properly organized and distributed. The foraging operations, while militarily necessary, created significant controversy that would persist long after the war ended. Union soldiers, many from industrial regions, where such agricultural wealth was unknown, were amazed by Mississippi's productivity. Vast plantations stretched as far as the eye could see, their fields bursting with crops and their warehouses full of stored provisions. Local civilian populations, initially hostile to the Union invasion, gradually adopted a stance of sullen cooperation as it became clear that resistance would only bring harsher treatment. The psychological impact was significant. Many Mississippi residents were seeing Union soldiers up close for the first time and were surprised to find them disciplined professionals, rather than the barbaric invaders described in Confederate propaganda. On May 14th, advance elements of Grant's army encountered Johnston's Confederates near Jackson. The Battle of Jackson proved brief, but decisive, with superior Union numbers forcing Confederate withdrawal after only a few hours of fighting. More importantly, the victory allowed Grant to destroy vital railroad connections that linked Vicksburg with the rest of the Confederacy. Military historians at the United States Army War College have extensively studied Grant's Jackson campaign as an example of operational-level warfare that achieved strategic objectives through tactical excellence. The destruction of railroad infrastructure, telegraph lines, and supply depots effectively isolated Vicksburg from outside support, transforming Pemberton's garrison from a strategic threat into a tactical problem. Johnston's retreat from Jackson left Pemberton in an impossible position. With Union forces now positioned between Vicksburg and the Confederate Relief Army, he faced the choice of abandoning his fortress city or remaining isolated behind its defenses. Confederate President Jefferson Davis had issued explicit orders to hold Vicksburg at all costs, but military reality suggested that such orders might be impossible to obey. Grant's rapid campaign through central Mississippi had covered over 100 miles in less than 2 weeks, fighting 5 separate battles and defeating every Confederate force encountered. The Army's morale, initially shaken by months of failed experiments around Vicksburg, soared as soldiers realized they were participating in one of the war's most successful campaigns. By May 16th, Union forces were approaching Vicksburg from the east, the direction from which Confederate defenders least expected an attack. Pemberton, desperate to prevent complete encirclement, sortied from Vicksburg's defenses with nearly 20,000 troops, hoping to break through Union lines and link up with Johnston's retreating army. The resulting Battle of Champion Hill, what proved to be the largest land engagement of the entire Vicksburg campaign, fought on terrain that perfectly illustrated how geography continued to shape every aspect of the struggle for control of the Mississippi River. The dawn of May 16, 1863, broke gray and humid over the rolling hills east of Vicksburg, where the fate of the Mississippi River and perhaps the entire Confederacy would be decided in a single day's fighting. Champion Hill, rising 140 feet above the surrounding countryside, dominated the landscape like a natural fortress, its slopes covered with dense woods that would soon echo with the thunder of artillery and the cries of wounded men. Lieutenant General John Clifford Pemberton had chosen his ground carefully. With nearly 22,000 Confederate troops, he occupied a strong defensive position along a ridge line that controlled the main roads leading to Vicksburg. His plan was simple but desperate: defeat Grant's army in detail before Union forces could concentrate their full strength, then retreat to Vicksburg before Johnston's relief army could be destroyed. Separately, Grant, approaching with 3 separate corps totaling over 32,000 men, recognized the opportunity that Pemberton's sortie had created. For the first time since the campaign began, Confederate forces had left their fortified positions and were offering battle on ground where Union numerical superiority could prove decisive. The weather remained clear and dry, perfect conditions for the massive troop movements that would be required. The battle opened at first light when advance elements of General James Birdseye McPherson's 17th Corps encountered Confederate pickets near the crossroads settlement of Edwards Station. What began as a routine skirmish escalated rapidly as both sides fed reinforcements into the fighting. transforming a minor engagement into the largest land battle fought in Mississippi. During the entire war, Confederate artillery, positioned on Champion Hill's commanding heights, initially dominated the battlefield. Battery after battery of rifled cannon swept the approaches with devastating effect, forcing Union infantry to take cover in whatever depressions and gullies the terrain offered. The psychological impact was severe. Many Union regiments were experiencing their first taste of concentrated artillery fire, and the screaming shells created panic in formations that had been confident just hours earlier. General Alvin Peterson, Hovey's division, bore the brunt of the initial Confederate bombardment. As they attempted to advance up Champion Hill's southern slope, the terrain favored defenders, with thick undergrowth channeling attacking formations into predictable corridors. Where Confederate rifles waited in prepared positions, Hovey's men, mostly Midwestern farmers and laborers who had volunteered for 3-year enlistments, displayed remarkable courage under fire, but found themselves pinned down short of their objectives. The battle's turning point came when Grant personally arrived on the field around mid-morning and immediately grasped the tactical situation. Rather than continuing the costly frontal assault on Champion Hill's strongest positions, he ordered a coordinated attack that would use the terrain's natural features to achieve surprise. McPherson's corps would continue to pressure the Confederate center, while McClernand's 13th Corps moved to threaten Pemberton's left flank. Confederate Brigadier General Lloyd Tillman, commanding the division holding Champion Hill's summit, recognized the danger as Union forces began working around his positions. He had fought in the campaign's earlier battles and understood that defeat here would mean the complete isolation of Vicksburg. Desperate messages went out to Pemberton's headquarters, requesting reinforcements that were already committed elsewhere on the battlefield. The fighting reached its climax around noon, when Hovey's Reformed Division, reinforced by fresh regiments, launched a final assault on Champion Hill's slopes. The attack succeeded through a combination of careful preparation and sheer determination. Union artillery, finally in position to provide effective support, laid down a devastating bombardment that silenced many Confederate batteries and allowed infantry to close with their objectives. Hand-to-hand combat raged across Champion Hill's summit as Union and Confederate forces grappled for control of the crucial high ground. The Botetord artillery, one of Virginia's finest Confederate batteries, fought desperately to save their guns, but was overwhelmed by charging Union infantry. The psychological impact of losing Champion Hill sent shockwaves through Confederate ranks, as soldiers who had considered their position impregnable suddenly found themselves retreating in disorder. Pemberton, recognizing that his sortie had failed, ordered a general withdrawal toward Vicksburg. The retreat quickly became a rout as Confederate formations, separated by the dense terrain, lost cohesion and began streaming toward the Big Black River in growing disorder. Union pursuit was relentless, with cavalry and artillery harassing the fleeing Confederates whenever the terrain permitted. The Battle of Champion Hill cost the Confederacy over 3,800 casualties, including Brigadier General Tillman, who was killed while attempting to rally his retreating troops. Union losses, while significant at over 1,400 men, were sustainable given Grant's numerical advantage and strategic position. More importantly, the victory effectively ended Confederate hopes of breaking Grant's stranglehold on Vicksburg. With Pemberton's field army shattered and Johnston's relief force still days away, the fortress city was now truly isolated. The trap that Grant had been preparing for months was finally closing, and the weather, waterways, and nature of warfare had all aligned to make Union victory almost inevitable. As night fell over the Champion Hill battlefield, Grant understood that the campaign's decisive phase was about to begin. Vicksburg still had to be taken, and its defenders would fight with the desperation of men who knew that defeat meant the effective end of Confederate control over the Mississippi River. The morning of May 19, 1863, found Vicksburg's Confederate defenders peering anxiously over their ramparts at the vast Union army, spreading across the hills and valleys surrounding their city. The defeat at Champion Hill had shattered Pemberton's field force, driving the survivors back into Vicksburg's prepared defenses. With Grant's victorious army in close pursuit, the fortress city that had defied Union efforts for over 6 months now faced complete encirclement. Grant's 45,000 troops took up positions in a semicircle, extending from the Mississippi River north of Vicksburg to the river south of the city, while Admiral Porter's gunboats controlled the waterway itself. For the first time since the campaign began, weather, waterways, and warfare had aligned perfectly to serve Union's strategic objectives. Grant initially hoped to take Vicksburg by direct assault, believing that Confederate morale had been broken by their recent defeats. On May 19th and again on May 22nd, Union forces launched coordinated attacks against the city's defensive perimeter. Both assaults failed with heavy casualties, proving that Vicksburg's defenders retained their fighting spirit. Despite being cut off from outside support, the failed assaults taught Grant a crucial lesson about the relationship between terrain and military tactics. Vicksburg's defensive positions, carved into limestone bluffs and reinforced with months of engineering work, could not be taken by conventional infantry attacks regardless of the number of troops committed. The city would have to be reduced by siege operations that combine artillery bombardment, systematic approach works, and the inevitable effects of starvation and disease. The siege that followed became one of the most scientifically conducted operations in military history. Union engineers, many of them former civilian mining engineers recruited specifically for this campaign, began digging approach trenches that zigzagged toward Confederate defensive lines. The work proceeded methodically, following principles of siegecraft that dated back to the 17th century, but had rarely been applied on such a scale in American warfare. Weather conditions during the siege proved both blessing and curse for the opposing armies. The hot, humid Mississippi summer created appalling conditions in both Union trenches and Confederate fortifications. Temperatures regularly exceeded 90 degrees Fahrenheit, while humidity levels made even minimal physical exertion exhausting. Drinking water became scarce as both armies drew from increasingly polluted sources. The civilian population of Vicksburg, estimated at nearly 5,000 souls, endured conditions that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. Families who had once lived in comfortable homes were forced into caves carved from the limestone bluffs, emerging only during brief lulls in the artillery bombardment that raged day and night. Food became increasingly scarce as Union naval patrols prevented any supplies from reaching the city by river. Contemporary accounts preserved in the Mississippi Department of Archives and History describe civilian conditions during the siege that shocked even hardened military observers on both sides. Children grew weak from malnutrition, while adults consumed anything remotely edible, including pets, leather goods, and various forms of vegetation that would normally be considered inedible. Porter's naval bombardment added to the city's misery. The admiral's heavy guns, positioned both in the river and on the Louisiana shore, maintained a constant barrage that reduced much of Vicksburg to rubble. The psychological effect was perhaps even more devastating than the physical damage, as the constant noise prevented sleep and created a state of perpetual anxiety among defenders and civilians alike. Confederate attempts to break the siege proved futile. General Johnston, operating with a relief army of nearly 30,000 troops, made several half-hearted attempts to approach Vicksburg from the east, but was consistently outmaneuvered by Union forces. The terrain that had once protected Confederate communications now worked against them, as swamps and dense forests prevented rapid military movements. By late June, conditions within Vicksburg had become desperate. Food rations for both soldiers and civilians had been reduced to starvation levels, while disease began claiming victims at an alarming rate. Pemberton faced the agonizing choice between continuing a hopeless defense that would result in massive civilian casualties or surrendering the city that Confederate leadership had declared essential to their cause. The final phase of the siege demonstrated Grant's strategic genius. Rather than attempting to storm Vicksburg's defenses and suffer enormous casualties, he allowed time and logistics to accomplish what military force could not. The Mississippi River, which had been both obstacle and opportunity throughout the campaign, became the decisive factor as Union naval control prevented any possibility of resupply or reinforcement. On July 4, 1863, a date chosen for its symbolic significance, Pemberton surrendered Vicksburg and its garrison of nearly 30,000 Confederate troops. The formal surrender ceremony took place on the same bluffs where Confederate artillery had once commanded the Mississippi River, marking the end of Confederate control over the vital waterway. Grant's Vicksburg campaign had succeeded through a combination of strategic innovation, tactical flexibility, and careful attention to how geography shaped military operations. The weather had provided the dry conditions necessary for rapid movement across Mississippi, while the region's waterways had been transformed from obstacles into avenues of approach. Most importantly, the nature of warfare itself had evolved during the campaign, with traditional siege operations proving more effective than conventional battlefield tactics. The fall of Vicksburg, combined with Union victory at Gettysburg on the same day, marked the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. The Mississippi River was now under complete Union control from its source to the Gulf of Mexico, effectively splitting the Confederacy in two and opening the way for the final campaigns that would end the Civil War. As Grant accepted Pemberton's surrender on that humid July morning, he understood that the campaign had demonstrated something unprecedented in American military history: the successful integration of weather, waterways, and warfare into a single strategic concept that achieved decisive victory through innovation rather than mere brute force.